Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's talk with David Livingstone Smith, presenting his latest book, Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, joined in conversation by Paul Bloom. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding digital community. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. Coming up later this month, we will be featuring authors, including Jane Goodall and Susan Orlean, and many more. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask our speakers something, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question. We'll get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also, a reminder that if you would like closed captions, you can click the live transcript tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable them. In just a moment, I'm going to be posting the link to purchase tonight's featured book, Making Monsters, in the chat box. Your book purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and they support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So as always, thank you so much for tuning in during these strange virtual times. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Finally, as you have likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise, and if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve it quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. An award-winning author and philosopher, David Livingstone Smith is professor of philosophy at the University of New England. He's written numerous books, including Why We Lie, The Most Dangerous Animal, Less Than Human, which won the 2012 Anisfield Wolf Award for nonfiction, and On Inhumanity, which we had the pleasure of hosting him for last June. You can find his work, which has been hailed as, quote, philosophically sophisticated and prophetically courageous, featured in both documentaries and national and international media. Tonight, he's joined in conversation by award-winning psychologist Paul Bloom, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and professor emeritus of psychology at Yale University. He's the author of books such as How Pleasure Works, Against Empathy, and now The Sweet Spot, The Pleasures of Suffering and the Search for Meaning, to be published in the US on November 2nd. Tonight, the two are discussing Dr. Smith's latest book, Making Monsters, praised as a historically informed and theoretically rich exploration of how and why we dehumanize one another. Of the book and of his valuable work, Eric Schwitzgebel writes, "No one is doing better work on the psychology of dehumanization than David Livingstone Smith, and he brings to bear an impressive depth and breadth of knowledge in psychology, philosophy, history, and anthropology. Making Monsters is a landmark achievement." We're so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, to start things off, Dr. Smith, the digital podium is now yours.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for making this possible. And thank you, Paul Bloom, for being my interlocutor tonight. Paul is in many ways the ideal interlocutor, a philosophically sophisticated psychologist with tremendous theoretical imagination. So I thought I would say a few words to you at first to place the book in context, and then we can go right into the conversation afterwards. I became interested in dehumanization, it was 12 or 13 years ago now. I was researching the penultimate chapter of a book that came out in 2007 called The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War. And I came across all of this wartime propaganda depicting enemies as vicious predators, as vermin, as unclean animals, or as game animals that are fun to kill. And I thought, oh, this is really very interesting. let's look further. So after that book was done and, in the can and out, I started looking into the literature on dehumanization. And I was really quite surprised to discover that almost all of it was in social psychology. And when I say almost all of it, I mean 99% plus. There was virtually nothing in my home discipline of philosophy, to my mind, shockingly, or in other next door disciplines such as political science, anthropology, and whatnot. So I set out to write a book on dehumanization. That was my 2011 book, Less Than Human. When I wrote that book, I was kind of working things out as I went along. I attempted to do two things, or rather three things: pull everything together that I could find on the phenomenon of dehumanization, which required me to go through many, many different literatures and many different disciplines, theorize dehumanization, explain how it works, pop the hood and look at the engine, and also trace the history of the concept from ancient times to the present. My next book on dehumanization was published last year, and under the title On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It. And it was the product of 10 years of thinking, 10 years of refinement, 10 years of engaging with critiques, both my own critiques and the critiques of others of my 2011 position. And it was intended for a very, very broad audience. So it was not at all an academic book, although it has things to offer to academics. I wrote this with the idea that this is a topic which is too serious and too important for academics to split hairs over, or to split hairs over exclusively. The subsequent year, that is this year, this month, my book, Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, was released. There's some confusion about the official publication date. The official publication date is the 28th, but there are copies floating around. And you could think of this as the graduate version of the undergraduate book on inhumanity. That is, it goes into the topics much, much more deeply. And it goes into topics that my earlier book, indeed my earlier books, did not address with respect to dehumanization. But it's not a boring read, at least I don't think so. I want my books to be engaging. I want them to be good reads, to pull the reader in. So I hope I've accomplished that. I'm sure Paul will give me and you his opinion on whether I've succeeded in doing that. One thing to say about the book, you might think, well, 3 books on dehumanization, isn't this kind of repetitive? Well, I discovered early on that to understand dehumanization, as I conceive of it, I have to understand a lot more. I have to understand how the concept of the human works. I have to understand the nature of ideology. I have to understand the psychological processes such as essentialism, psychological essentialism, and hierarchical thinking, which I think play a crucial role in our dispositions to dehumanize others. So in order to make sense of dehumanization, we need to make sense of all these other things. And in my most recent book, I do this far more extensively, and I think far more accurately than I have done in the previous books. But that's for you, the readers, really to decide. Okay, that's my introductory bit. Paul, you ready to have a conversation?
Hello. Good. So I see my role here as to get the conversation started, to I'm going to say some really nice things about you. Then I'm going to ask you some sort of general questions. So, you don't want to give away too much for a book, but I do want to sort of ask you, what's your main claim? What do you mean by dehumanization? Get you sort of be clear on that sort of thing. And then we will, after we talk for, half hour, maybe less, we'll open up for questions. And I hope people go to the Q&A thing, which is down there, and start putting down questions. And when I see a critical mass of questions, I will just read out the questions. So we'll do it that way. So first a positive thing. I'm here, as a friend, but I'm also here as a huge fan. I find you a fearless and interesting and very important thinker on topics of extraordinary weight, and you handle them, I think, graciously and thoughtfully, and you have never written a dull sentence in your life. And so there's that, the intellectual contribution, and also you just write great books. This is the third of a trilogy, as you said, Less Than Human, On Inhumanity, and Now Making Monsters. And this is the graduate version of the undergraduate book that was done last. And that sounds forbidding, like, well, who wants to read the graduate version? But it is extremely well written. I mean it as a compliment when I say you don't write like a philosopher. You write extremely clear, crisp, conversational, and you're very clear about what you're saying and what you're not saying. And it makes you're an easy man to disagree with or to agree with, because it's clear what you're saying, and it's very interesting. So let me start on a personal note. You sort of sketched your intellectual journey, how this spawned out of your earlier book, but the question still remains: what motivated you to spend, what is it, a couple of decades now, becoming the world's expert on the most unpleasant topic you could imagine? Why dehumanization?
Well, I guess it's a peculiarity of me that I'm attracted to unpleasant topics. But actually, before answering that, let me say that what you said about me and my work was just so nice. We could end the thing here. It was just really so nice and warm and generous of you. I really appreciate it. It's very heartening. So, as you said, as you noted, I'm a philosopher, and I guess what that means is that I did my PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy. But in terms of what I do, I prefer to understand what I do is try to figure stuff out. And of course, there's lots and lots of stuff to figure out in the world. So how do you choose? Well, for me, a very important consideration is choosing things that promise to make a difference to life on Earth, choosing serious matters, and addressing them in ways that I hope will really give us a better handle on them. And that's important, because these are things, as serious matters, that we really need to get a handle on. So a lot of those things are bad things, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So I'm attracted in a way to addressing the brokenness of the human condition and doing my best to ameliorate it through the limited tools available to me, thinking and writing, and doing my best to heal things. I want to heal things. And, to make it really corny, I want to change the world. That's the point. That's the point of what I do, however quixotic that might turn out to be. And I have no delusions about the difference, if any, that my work will make.
It's a good answer. We interact a bit on social media. I see you on Twitter, and sometimes you're a bit impatient with your philosophical colleagues who come from a different direction. I think you have some scorn for people who you see as simply playing linguistic games and doing cute mathematical puzzles when there's so much urgent issues to be addressed.
Yeah, I really should be less, sometimes scornfulness comes through. That's absolutely right. I think there's a term that I use, which is conspicuous intellectual consumption. And I think that's a disease of a lot of philosophy. That is, one can show off by engaging in questions, the answers of which make no difference to anything at all, except perhaps curiosity about puzzles, and treat it as a virtue that the activity has no practical implications. And indeed, I think given the really important issues facing humanity, that's a shameful waste of a powerful and important resource, the human intellect.
Let me ask one more personal question about your journey here, which is, I've read all of your books on dehumanization, and I'm sincere in my praise for the writing, but sometimes they're tough reading because you are unsparing in your descriptions of the terrible things we do to one another. Both this book and your last book, and actually I think all three of your books, describe lynchings in some detail. And there's nothing gratuitous about it. You are using the cruelty in it to make deep points. But is it difficult to write these books?
It's not difficult to learn about these things and write about them. Writing the books, of course, are difficult in other ways. Not anymore. I'm accustomed to it. It's my spouse, who's also a philosopher, tells me maybe I don't sleep well sometimes because I'm reading about Auschwitz in bed.
Yeah.
I don't think so. The analogy that I like to use is an oncologist, right? I'm used to cancer. It's not shocking to me anymore. And I want to find out. I want to find these details out because that's the only way I can address properly what I want to address.
So for you, the cancer is dehumanization. And you begin this book, I think, very admirably, making it clear what you mean by dehumanization, because as you know, the term gets used all the time. I have some interest in the topic. I have heard the term used to describe treating people less than their worth. Like, I go on Southwest Airlines and the seats are too small and I cancel my flight. And I say, this is dehumanizing. They should treat me with more respect. And, you understand the idea. A lot of social psychologists say we dehumanize one another when we think of certain people or certain groups as unintelligent or uncivilized or something. Some people can relate dehumanization to objectification and say it's the male gaze or the sexual gaze is inherently dehumanizing. And you are very clear to say you are not talking about any of these things.
Yes.
Those are interesting topics, but you're not talking about any of those things. You have a very special, very interesting take on dehumanization. So could you just take a few minutes and lay it out for the people here?
Sure. And let me sort of riff on what you just said, which is exactly right. So the word dehumanization has a lot of different meanings. It's used in lots of different ways, both in the vernacular and in the scholarly literature. In the scholarly literature, it's used in a number of logically independent ways, indeed contradictory ways. So I don't think any of those interpretations of dehumanization is incorrect. It just means a lot of things. And that places a special burden on anyone who wants to theorize dehumanization. That is, the word itself is not terribly informative, except for gesturing that whatever it is bad, right? So what I mean by dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. And I choose these words very carefully. A couple of them are kind of vague. Others, well, for the most part, I mean members of our species, but technically, I think one can dehumanize, it sounds paradoxical, one can dehumanize non-human animals. That has to do with the way the concept of the human works. And creatures, notice I didn't say animals, because I want to include in that category demons and monsters, hence the title of my new book, Making Monsters. So I try to remind the reader of that a lot, because it's so easy to get lost in various competing notions of what dehumanization is. There's a question that might arise, well, why do I do that? Why am I not a pluralist about dehumanization? Well, I think this array of phenomena, first of all, every example of it is important. I mean, racism is important and transphobia is important. All these things are important. And I think all of them have their particular dynamics. And it does not do us a service to lump them all together under one heading, right? Rather, I'm a big fan of making distinctions and teasing things out. So if we want to talk about cruel and inhumane treatment per se, that's fine. Let's investigate it as such. What I want to do is investigate this kind of attitude, this process that takes place in people's heads. And I want to do that because it is associated with some of the very, very worst things that people have done to one another. So although all the other things are bad, this is bad in a very, very special way.
So I like that answer, and I have some sympathy, as you know, for your desire to reserve dehumanization for a pretty serious thing. I've long criticized social psychology. Many social psychologists say we tend to think of, say, certain outgroups as stupid or uncouth, and they say that's dehumanizing. And I'm thinking, there's all sorts of people I think are stupid and uncouth. I think they're human. They're just, it's a very human thing to be stupid or uncouth. Why are you calling it dehumanization to wrap it up this heavy weight? You know, I mean, sometimes it could be fair. If people think Jews are greedy, that's not very nice. But still, being greedy is a very human thing to be. But here comes a question, and I'll phrase it as an objection, which is, your characterization of dehumanization, where we make people into monsters, where we literally, not metaphorically, literally see them as not human. I'm convinced by your work that this happens in the Holocaust and lynchings. But I would think that you wouldn't say it happens anymore, at least not in a country like the United States. Like, okay, people might have bad attitudes, but this group, bad attitude, that group, I might be angry at the Republicans. They may not think much of me, But it would seem then that dehumanization is something you find in faraway lands or faraway times, but you wouldn't see it in contemporary times. I don't think you agree with that.
No, I don't. I think it's, and this is where it gets methodologically really tricky. And so let me kind of take a step backwards and talk about the work in social psychology. The study of dehumanization, in my sense, does not lend itself to the psychological laboratory. So there's a kind of real difficult distinction to make. When people, first of all, people using explicitly dehumanizing language, as was used against the victims of lynching, or Jews during the Third Reich, or the Rohingya in Myanmar today, there are many other areas where this bubble has bubbled up or is bubbling up. The use of this explicit language doesn't necessarily entail a dehumanizing attitude. So we certainly use derogatory language, animalistic slurs, and so on to hurt people, to humiliate them, and so on, with the full understanding that they are human beings. And we should come back to this concept of human in a little bit, because it's not really transparent. So we need to be, and by the same token, the failure to use that kind of language, that kind of explicit language, does not entail that the humanization is not happening. So there's a very, very subtle contextual judgments we need to make to diagnose very fallibly, and that's just the nature of the beast, whether or not dehumanization is going on. So, for instance, the discourse of criminality, I think, is very, very often an expression of dehumanizing attitudes. Well, why? Well, it's not about criminal acts, right? The discourse isn't there are people who commit criminal acts. It's that these people are criminals. And if you look at the way folks are discussed, it's like bad to the bone, bad essence, and so on. Now, all that being said, there are still in the United States, in our civilization now, explicit and overt expressions of what looks like dehumanization. So I needn't remind the listeners of Donald Trump's propensity to refer to people as animals, for instance. Did he believe they're animal? I don't know. I don't know. But it's certainly a live possibility.
So you said at the onset, you said something which I really disagree with, which is you said this doesn't lend itself to the psychological laboratory. And I believe professionally everything lends itself to the psychological laboratory. And you would believe this too. You're making claim of how people think.
Yeah.
So we would want to, there's all sorts of ways to test this. You just, one way is see what they say, see what they do. You could ask them questions. You could scan their brains. You could do it, and some of them I think are kind of foolish, but in the end, you're making a psychological thesis.
Yes, I'm making a psychological thesis indeed, but one of my problems with the psychological literature, and it's one of the things that inspired me to write these books, was my dissatisfaction with the way social psychologists were handling this, is that to understand dehumanization, we need to ask not just what's going on in people's heads. That's really important, and that's the bit that psychologists can really get a hold of readily. But it's also what people's heads are in. That is, we have to have a really sensitive ecological approach to these things, the way that we have to consider the political forces that are being brought to bear on people such that their psychological dispositions are activated, leading them to conceive of others as less than human. And one of the challenges of that is it requires bringing together distinct explanatory and theoretical vocabularies, which is always a challenge.
But so let me zoom in. Let me just, here I am in Toronto. It's unseasonably warm now. Toronto is a great city to be in. It's very heterogeneous. There's murders, there's rapes, there's many ethnicities, some in conflict, there's disagreements. So you would say, I think, that it's not merely there's prejudice in the city. There's not merely there's violence, and there are some cases where people are dehumanizing other people. They're literally thinking of them as monsters.
I would think that very probable. Yeah.
So let's get started. So take me. Some of my friends in social psychology will say that although I'm a seemingly nice person, I'm just in some notion of it, I'm a racist, because we're all racists, they might say. And I don't know if that's true or false, but that's a claim that's been made, and people think about that in different ways. Would you think that I dehumanize other people?
That you do?
Yeah.
I don't have any evidence that you do.
But would there be any sort of normal practice that a normal person would do? Not some sort of demagogue or criminal, but like
Oh, yes. Well, look, most people who are engaged in dehumanization are normal people. So I begin the book with this, the testimony of a Rwandan genocidaire who talks about not seeing his victims as human. Let's suppose that that recollection was correct.
Yes.
Well, as I point out, I don't have any reason to think that he was deranged, that there was anything psychologically unusual or abnormal about him. I do think he was in an altered state of consciousness when he was performing those acts, but that's not the same, right? So if we look at history, there are certain circumstances that people can be in which makes them receptive. And actually, this leads to a very important point, receptive to influences that lead them to dehumanize others. I say that's an important point because as I try to make super clear in this book, particularly in the chapter on ideology and then the extended case study afterwards, I don't think dehumanization arises spontaneously from the inside. I think it's an interaction between certain sorts of social forces, more specifically propaganda and ideology, and a set of psychological dispositions which get influenced by those forces. And that's another reason why I said that the phenomenon itself doesn't lend itself to investigation in the psychological laboratory. So that was perhaps a little bit overstated. The phenomenon in its fullness and its complexity doesn't lend itself to that.
So again, I'm trying to push you on a part which may be less convincing to some, and maybe I want you to persuade me. When you said an example, you said this person committed genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And there, it's your case is very strong.
Mm-hmm.
But even Trump, who's like the whipping boy for any one of us who wants to ascribe a negative trait, even he said he called them animals, but you say you can't know. I also Trump's critics. There was I actually have her name here. A critic, Anna Navarro, was on CNN, and she said Trump uses dehumanizing language. He calls people animals. She may have read your book. She calls people animals. It's disgusting, and we should never do that. It's the worst thing you could do. Took somebody 10 minutes to find a tweet from her saying, should Donald Trump drop out of race? Yes, he should. He should drop out of the human race. He is an animal. Apologies to animals.
Well, it comes very.
I don't think she was. I think she's just being mean. It's mean or funny and all that. Is there a case in contemporary, let's say United States, where most people are, in United States, where you think that there's a large community that dehumanizes? There's no genocides in progress here. Do you think his attitudes towards criminals is the best case?
Yes, I think attitudes towards criminals is a very, very good case.
Do you think a large proportion of people think criminals are not only awful people, unredeemable,
I think in
an interesting sense, monsters?
A lot of people see them as primitive bestial beings, yeah.
I'm getting questions and I want to leave plenty of time. I'm getting a lot of questions. This is good. And so I'm going to sort of fade up, but I have to ask you one twist question,
okay.
Which is, you're very interesting. And one way you're interesting is that you are very into Freud,
Mm-hmm.
the most unfashionable of all,
Mm-hmm.
Scholars. And were you trained in psychoanalysis?
Yeah, I was a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in my previous career. And in fact, when I switched to philosophy, I did my dissertation on Freud as a philosopher.
So is there any sense in which Freud's ideas or Freud's perspective informs your thinking of dehumanization?
Oh, very much so. I like to say Freud's my homie. So he's always, as it were, looking over my shoulder. Now, does that mean that I agree with everything he said or even most of what he said? No. He didn't even agree with most of what he said. Actually, he changed his mind a lot. But there's a certain kind of spirit in which I undertake my work, which I think is really, really influenced by Freud. And if I were to characterizes, and actually you characterized it very well the last time we spoke, Paul. There's something about an appreciation of the complexity and contradictoriness of the human being, and the reluctance to embrace shallow solutions to understanding important psychological problems. I take that from Freud, as well as some very much more particular things that I think he got right.
Good. I agree with you, by the way. I mean, as a card-carrying psychologist, I'm supposed to ridicule Freud, and he got so much wrong in so many silly ways. But I think he might have lost every battle but won the war in that he has this appreciation of, for one thing, the idea of a dynamic unconscious, which I think we tend to believe in and never credit Freud. And then the second thing is this honest appreciation for the complexity and richness, particularly regarding sexuality of people. Now I'm going to be a good commentator, and I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to select the questions not based on quality, but just kind of quasi-randomly. This one is from Krista, and it's a nice continuation. Could you speak more of the social forces that give rise to dehumanization?
Sure, and I can use Freud here, actually. So I was really helped to understand dehumanization by, oddly enough, Freud's book on religion called The Future of an Illusion, which, by the way, was written in a politically volatile situation. It was published in 1927 under the shadow of rising political anti-Semitism and Nazism. Though he does not breathe a word of this in the book, I think the book is extraordinarily pertinent to this. So what does Freud say in there? It says religious belief, and he's speaking particularly about Christianity, is a response to the awareness of human helplessness. He uses that word a lot in the text, helplessness. So we, reflective creatures that we are, can not avoid the awareness that we're vulnerable. The human condition is vulnerable, and it's vulnerable on two fronts. One is in relation to the forces of nature, which are going to kill us and kill everyone we care about. And the other is vulnerable to human injustice, the predations that human beings commit on one another. Freud thought this arouses in us this longing for salvation, this longing for transcendence of this condition, and religious ideas express these things. So we have an afterlife, we're not going to die, and the bad people really will be punished, unlike in the real world, for the most part, by an all-powerful and protective parent. Now, if you look at how authoritarian politicians ply their trade, there's something really, on the face of it, might seem counterintuitive. That is, they often spend a lot of time making their audience feel insecure, vulnerable. So here's a paradigmatic example, which I've written about. If we go back to Donald Trump, his very first speech when he descended the escalator, he began by saying that we're the laughingstock of the world, that everyone's taking advantage of us, that we've really lost our position of power in the world, and so on and so forth. He then went on to talk about the enemies from without and within, not only laughing at us, they're harming us. And this is where he made his notorious statement about Mexico is not sending their best, they're sending murderers and rapists and so on. So, of course, if that's done effectively, then you get people to feel surplus helplessness, surplus vulnerability. And that sets the stage for the authoritarian leader playing the role of God, offering salvation. Join me, I'm the only one who can do it. I can fix all the problems, and so on. Now, the reason why that's important for dehumanization is the thesis that I did not understand when I wrote the 2011 book, Less Than Human. I think I do understand pretty well now, which is that dehumanization is prompted from the outside. It doesn't arise unbidden within the human mind. It's not like outgroup bias, right? It's something special. And it's often at the hands of authorities, let's use the term very broadly, who manipulate us into thinking of others in terrible ways. So that only works, I believe, though, or at least it works most effectively when there's a pre-existing ideology that's sort of baked in to the society. So the authoritarian leader then sort of lights this dry kindling, which is perhaps latent, and it bursts into flame. Now, if you think that through, something else becomes clear. This is actually quite testable. It implies that the more objectively vulnerable people's circumstances are, the more readily there will be uptake of dehumanizing propaganda. So an economic downturn, people not having enough to eat, people not having jobs, people not having healthcare, all the things that might make them feel marginal and vulnerable can then be manipulated by people for their own nefarious political ends.
Are the poor more susceptible to dehumanize than the rich?
That's a good question, and it's an empirical question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Let me ask, actually, it was a great question that was asked, and I'm going to take it from a different direction, which is, there's a story about dehumanization, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, and I want to check with it, which is, it talks about killing in wartime. And the premise of the story is, it's difficult for us to kill people. We've been so, either because of innately or because we've been socialized to, but the idea of putting a stranger to death for no reason outside that they're on a different team is incredibly difficult for us. And the claim, which has been controversial, is that soldiers in World War II, many of them would just fire their guns above the heads of others. They couldn't shoot them.
Yeah.
And so there's what some generals call the problem of modern battle. And the solution is to get them to think of their opponents as less than human, to dehumanize them, making it possible to kill them. Is that consistent with your mode of thinking?
Yeah, so you're referring to S.L.A. Marshall's
Men Against Fire.
Yeah, he was a strange character, a larger than life character. I'm not sure how trustworthy all of his claims were, but I think that
there are claims he made up the day they were shooting over the head. Yes.
But I think the central idea is indeed correct, and it would be surprising if it was incorrect. Given our ultra social nature, it would be really surprising if it was easy for us to take one another's lives. However, again, this is another theme of the book. We have this amazing capacity to engineer ourselves and develop workarounds, develop ways of short-circuiting what inhibitions we might have against doing lethal harm up close and personal to others. And dehumanization is one of those ways. It's not the only one. People often misinterpret me saying, Smith thinks that dehumanization is necessary for atrocity. No, I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think it's sufficient either. I just think it helps the process along. So yeah, that's consistent. There's some really interesting work on toxic versus less toxic versions of dehumanization on the battlefield.
Good. Mohit pulls up one of the issues you had raised in passing, which is very interesting theoretically, which is we're talking about dehumanization, human. So he wants to know from you, what do you think human is? So he writes, he or she writes, is the concept human creature a prototype concept? Does it have necessary and sufficient conditions? What does that mean for what it is to dehumanize others?
Yeah, well, I think in the real world, as distinct from logical space, nothing has necessary and sufficient conditions. That's my default position. But you can come close. I see the category of the human as fundamentally an ideological category. So there's kind of an assumption that's often made, well, science has told us what human is. It's being species Homo sapien. Well, that's actually not true. If you actually look at the literature, the scientific literature, sometimes it's genus Homo, sometimes it's Homo sapiens, sometimes it's Homo sapiens sapiens, sometimes it's a much more expansive group of taxa that are part of our broad lineage. And you can see how promiscuously this term human is used in the paleoanthropological literature. And there's a good reason for that. It's not a scientific term, it's a folk term. It's not like Homo sapiens, that's a scientific term. So what interested me is trying to figure out something in common with not only the scientific uses of the term, but also the far more extensive vernacular uses of the term, cross-culturally. And I think that the notion of human, it's a little more complicated than this, and I explain that in the book, but this is a good enough version. What human boils down to is my kind. Now, you might say, my kind? Well, you know, you're a philosopher. Does that mean human equals philosophers? Being philosophers, your kind? No. What I mean is my essentialized kind. So the idea that we, whoever we are, belong to a basic kind. And how we fill that in, what we conceive of our basic kind, be it a biological taxonomic category, or a racial group, or a religious group, that becomes the content of the human. And the reason it's an ideological content, well, it's partially because of that, but also because when we identify others as human, we privilege them in certain ways. So the non-human, again, this is an oversimplification, but it's one that I'll indulge in. The non-human does not merit the same degree of care, let's put it that way, than we do, the us.
And that connects to your sort of throwaway remark, which says that human may be granted to some animals,
yes,
maybe beloved pets.
Yes.
In a way that, you know, the vermin that sometimes occupy our house definitely don't get treated.
That's right. I've been lately thinking giving an animal a name is significant in that respect.
Yes. If I remember right, one of the rights in the United Nations list of so-called universal rights is a surprising one. It's a right for everybody to have a name.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I think it captures that insight there, which is, and if you think about it, well, people have names, and it doesn't seem, you know, it doesn't seem the same thing as not to be murdered or whatever. But at some time, I think there's a wisdom there.
Yeah. So there are a lot of there are customs. Now, who wrote this? It's an anthropologist. I've blanked on her name. In various cultures, the infant is thought to be ensouled at a particular time, often after birth. And that corresponds to when they're named, when they undergo the naming ceremony. So the acquisition of the soul goes with the acquisition of the name.
Yes. There's more questions I want to be able to ask you, but I find this one really interesting from Suzanne. Apologies if I mispronounced the name. How does positive dehumanization work? For instance, saints, prophets.
Yeah,
I don't
think that as dehumanization. So D implies degrading, right? And it implies less than. So some people have used the term superhumanization, but I think that's a misleading term. And the psychologists who in fact coined that term actually see it as a form of dehumanization. So the idea of these divine or semi-divine beings, I see that as something next door to dehumanization. And obviously the theoretical apparatus that I use to understand dehumanization could be extended sort of in the opposite direction. I think that part of this territory, conceptual territory, is bound up with how religiously motivated violence sometimes works. So if we look at dehumanization as a kind of distance creation, it creates moral distance, just like long-range weapons create physical distance. Well, you can create distance in a different way as well, by elevating yourself. And again, I don't think I mentioned this, but religious ideologies often play a role in the disinhibition of violence against other human beings. And I think it's this distancing thing that may be an important contributing factor to this.
Great. Mindful of the time, I'll ask two other questions, both from the questions sent in. Lois asked a series of extremely interesting questions, but they're each extremely interesting. So I'm just going to choose one of them, which is about, does dehumanization depend on a set of stereotypes held by one group towards another? And so what is the relationship between dehumanization and stereotyping in your view?
Okay, so I would like to go a little bit more narrowly than stereotype, because I think there are certain types of stereotyping that are important for dehumanization. And I want to add here that this bit of my work is in flux. I don't think what I'm about to say is incorrect, but I think it's incomplete. And there's a whole additional project that I want to do about how essentialization works, which is pertinent to this. Right. So as a matter of fact, many, maybe most, I never say all when it comes to the realm of living things like us, examples of dehumanization are closely tied to racialization. But in order for that to make sense, one needs to have an accurate conception of, or let's say a certain conception of what racialization is. What is it to regard a group of people as belonging to a race? And I don't mean fancy philosophical notions that people work out in their studies. I'm interested in how these concepts actually live in the world. Well, I think there are three components to this. One is races are supposed to be fundamentally and unalterably different types of human beings. Second, they are hierarchically arranged. So I think racism is built into the very notion of race. And third, that membership in the race is transmitted biologically, typically, but not always by descent. So typically, but not inevitably, from parents to the offspring. The pattern of thinking involved in racial thinking of that sort is extraordinarily similar to the pattern of thinking that's found in dehumanization. And it's not by accident then that dehumanized groups of people are typically first racialized. So to not put too fine a point on it, it's something like this. Here's this group of people. They're different from us. They're inferior to us. They're less than us. They're human beings, but they're less than us. They're third-rate human beings. They're defective human beings. They're primitive. They're morally suspect, whatever. So there, when this racialization process happens, immediately a whole bunch of racial stereotypes are brought to bear on this group of people. So dehumanization just takes the derogation further. And rather than thinking of them simply as lesser humans, the dehumanizer thinks of these people as less than human. So there's a categorical shift rather than simply a shift in value. So yeah, because of that, stereotyping, in particular racial stereotyping, is super important in my view for dehumanization, for understanding how dehumanization works. And
I can't resist a
when
short
in
question to follow up from this before the final question. I think we have till 8, and then there's, the Lois's series of questions ends with, is it really ever possible to be dehumanizing only a single individual? And I'm wondering, as an example, people's attitudes towards Harvey Weinstein. So Harvey Weinstein was convicted of being a serial rapist, was broadly extremely despised, went to prison, and certainly I think many people could be said to honestly think of him as a monster, as less than human.
Yes.
And not, he is Jewish, so one could say that, but I think basically, even though he's white.
Yeah.
So would that count as a case of dehumanization?
I think very probably, but this has to do with my newer project. So if I can spend a moment on this. In the literature, in the psychological literature, there are kind of two parallel notions of how essentialization occurs. One is that it's kinds that have essences. The other is individuals have essences. So there's all the stuff like you described in How Pleasure Works, the Hitler sweater sort of thing, right? So we can attribute kind essences, I think, and I think we do, and we attribute individual essences. Now, some people try to reconcile the two. They say, well, the kind essences is just an aggregate of individual essences that are similar. I don't accept that. What I suspect very much is that there are two parallel cognitive tracks here, two distinctive kinds of essentialization. And if that's the case, then it gives me the theoretical room I need and I want to understand how individuals can be dehumanized.
That sounds like a fascinating project. Is that in your next book?
Well, I've got to wait for my next semester sabbatical.
Okay. Here's the final question. We got like 30 seconds, but it's a really nice question to end on. It's by somebody with the wonderful name Anonymous Attendee. And it was, what do you hope readers get out of your book? And what might they do once they read it?
Okay. Well, first of all, the book's written for everyone. So what do I want all people to get out of it? That this is a serious issue, that it's understandable, and that we should pay it a great deal of attention and do something about it. We're not going to be able to do something about it unless we understand how it works. And although one might luxuriate and say, well, we're not in the Third Reich anymore. We're not in Jim Crow anymore. That's short historical memory. These things were yesterday, and they may well be tomorrow. And actually, one of my very big concerns is the impact of climate change on our civilization, on our civilizations, the movements of refugees, the collapse of infrastructures. And I think this is very likely to create a perfect storm for some of the worst, most toxic, most dangerous forms of dehumanization.
That was an appropriately grim ending to a fascinating discussion of a very grim topic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David.
Oh,
Thanks for everybody who participated.
Everyone pre-order Paul's book, The Sweet Spot.
Oh yeah, buy my book too.
Oh, thank you both so much. That was a really powerful talk. And I'm especially glad that you addressed climate change at the end. I was wondering that the whole time, but didn't jump in to ask my own questions. So thanks for touching on that. I think it's especially relevant. Thank you everyone also for spending your evening with us on this Friday. So I guess my final words on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you again, both of you.
Thank you.